Hello, everyone. Welcome into Above My Pay Grade. My name is Eric. Thanks for tuning in. If you haven't already, hit subscribe. I want to talk about a article from Robert Reich, our favorite Keynesian economist. And the article says, corporate greed, not wages, are behind inflation. It's time for price controls. I just want to go through this article and see what he has to say and see if you guys potentially agree with it. And maybe poke holes in some of his arguments because I don't think they're very sound. But Robert Reich, he's a fairly prominent, I'd say socialism light. Definitely, he's a former labor secretary, and he's big into, he talks about corporate greed a lot, which I don't disagree that corporations are greedy. I think that's the nature of corporations. I don't think he thinks that governments are greedy, though, which they definitely are. He writes, this economists assume that the underlying economic problem is a tight labor market causing wages to rise and prices to rise in response, and they believe interest rate increases are necessary to slow the wage price inflation. Obviously, if your wage, you have to pay your people more, then you have to charge more, so on and so forth, and that keeps kind of a vicious cycle. And his contention is these people are wrong. It is not because of wages. That's because wages haven't even kept up with inflation, which he would be correct. And his contention is the underlying economic problem is a profit price inflation. It's caused by corporations raising their prices above their increasing costs. Costs go up 10%, they raise prices 20%, so on and so forth. And they're taking advantage of the so-called inflation to price gouge. And if you just think about it, price gouging is only, you only have the ability to price gouge if you have a monopoly. If you have competition, you can't, and there's other people selling the same widget, and they have the ability to sell it for cheaper. It is often very hard to price gouge. So, assuming that is the case, let's see what he has to say. Corporations have the power to raise prices without losing customers because they face little to no competition. Since the 1980s, 2/3 of all American industries have become more concentrated. I mean, instead of this kind of smaller companies competing against each other, they buy up these huge, they buy each other out, and they have these huge conglomerates, and they're able to price gouge. I do think the government has a vested interest in stopping monopolies, but he does not talk about why there isn't competition. And if you think about the world we live in today, in a technology-driven world, the bigger your company becomes, the harder it is to pivot. Think about any bureaucracy, any corporation, that becomes their kind of Achilles heel. They are very big, they're very powerful, but when it comes to tech and pivoting and finding holes in the market and filling them, they have to go through all this bureaucracy, and so they don't have the speed to pivot. And that's where smaller companies can come in and capture that market. Now, why would a smaller company not do that today? My contention, and he doesn't mention it in this article, my contention is bureaucracy in government makes it very difficult to start a business today. If you talk to any entrepreneur, they have to learn to be a lawyer half the time just to start a business in America because of regulations, because of all the fees and all the things involved in starting a business when it comes to competition. So I would agree with Robert Reich that competition is what would drive down prices. And we don't have a ton of it today. But we don't live in the difference in the world today is that I think the government is involved in business, which has allowed for these corporations to grow massively because who funds them? Who funds politics? These huge corporations. And then these politicians scratch their back once they get elected. And it makes it not a very competitive space. And Robert Reich doesn't really mention that. He mainly just talks about the corporation. And in a free market, a corporation will always have competition. They'll always have competition. So that's my contention. Further down in the article, he suggests a windfall profits tax could also be helpful. This could be a temporary tax. There's nothing more permanent than a temporary government tax. We know this. This could be a temporary tax on price increases exceeding the producer price index cost for producing consumer goods. Price controls could also be a backstop. The current inflation originating from the pandemic is analogous to the inflation after the Second World War, when economists advocated temporary price controls to buy time to overcome supply bottlenecks and prevent corporate profiteering. Windfall profits tax, I think those are coming regardless because, oil companies are making tons of money, not discounting that they lost a ton of money during the pandemic. But as government starts changing the rules, they make business very difficult. They make the environment of business very difficult. What business owners want, what taxpayers want, is they want a set of rules that doesn't change, okay? That you cannot audible every year because they want predictability. And if you've ever seen markets and you've heard, predictability or lack thereof is kind of what makes markets go down, because markets thrive on predictability. They want those rules, and if governments are constantly changing them, and they're like, oh, if you make too much money, then we might have to think of a windfall profits tax. If you lose too much, no, government's always going to get theirs. But I would have to disagree with Robert Reich here. Windfall profits tax, although he thinks it might be helpful in the short term, I think it would make running a business near impossible because you don't know what the limit is. When you're looking at profits, you're like, well, I don't want to make too much money because the government's just going to take that extra amount. It just doesn't make any sense. And then lastly, price controls. I've talked about price controls on this channel before, but why do they not work? Without getting into the nuance, let's just say, put a price control on anything and then ask yourself, why would that be the price? Why don't you make it lower? It's the same thing with, and there are price controls on labor, by the way, because we have a minimum wage. But I always ask, why is the minimum wage and people want $15 an hour? Why 15? Why don't you make it 100? And that same question goes for the price of a good or service. If you're going to make it $10, why don't you make it $5? Why don't 2? And who's making these decisions? And are they fluid with market dynamics? They aren't. And they never work. And what it leads to is a shortage. Look at 1970 and the gas lines. It never works. I'll link his article in the description below. But I think there's a large majority of people I read online that think corporate greed is the cause of the inflation we're seeing today. And I'm not above thinking that corporations are greedy. I think that's their nature. Corporations want to make more money. But the way they're able to become monopolies is with the government's help. The way they're able to squash competition is with the government's help. So if you're looking for a solution, get government out of business, in my humble opinion. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. See you guys in the next one. Peace.